3:13 to 4:11. This is the second half of the second phase. Corresponds from the Sea of Reeds to Sinai, so the first half of the wilderness. This is the time of Israel's learning obedience, and they've got a lot of internal squabbles. Okay, they complain, they grumble, they fight with one another. And when they do, God comes, okay, look, I'm going to respond, but this is not how we do things when you're my people. Okay, so it's a time of learning. After Sinai, when they've said, oh yes, we'll be your people, you be our God, and they get sealed and all that stuff, then when they squabble and disobey, people die by the thousands. Right? So there's a time to learn what God requires, and then a time where you'll be held accountable. This first half of the wilderness is the time of learning. Okay, so it's preparation before judgment comes. There's a focus in this section on fearing God, which is the key wilderness trial, and loving the brotherhood. So these are all focused on kind of divine church relations. Sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart. So you are internalizing the commands. External behavior is no longer enough. Now you've got to kind of get the right motivations as well. And you come to know him for yourself, as we have said. The key lesson here is living to righteousness. Right? So having died to sins, having extended forgiveness that enables us to die effectively, then we can be united with Christ, and he enables us to live to righteousness and live in the things that God is calling us to do. Now there is one allusion here at the beginning. He says, their fear do not fear and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord. Now this is alluding back to Isaiah 8. And the people's fear do not fear and do not be troubled, but sanctify the Lord himself, and he will be your fear. Okay? Now if you remember Isaiah 8, we talked about this extensively in New Testament 1. You had Aram and Israel up in the north who had joined together and were planning to overthrow King Ahaz in Judah and set up Tabeel as king. And God says he's not going to let that happen. So the people of Judah feared attack from these northern kingdoms. And the Lord's message to Isaiah is don't fear what they fear. Don't be troubled. You fear me, and I'll make sure you're taken care of in what comes. Don't get caught up in fearing what all those around you fear, whether it's Aram and Israel or the coronavirus or whatever. Don't fear what they fear. You fear me. Do what I've told you to do, and I will become your rock. I will become your refuge in the midst of what all these other people fear. Does that make sense? So in each case, we have three groups. In Isaiah, we have Isaiah, the people from whom he is to differentiate himself, especially leaders like King Ahaz, and he's saying, don't fear what they fear. And then you have the invaders, whom the Judeans fear. In Peter's day, it was the people he's writing to, the people he's to differentiate himself from, who would be their fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, and then the invaders, or what they fear, as he's going to go on to explain, is the disapproval of the Gentiles. Right? So we can't do that because society doesn't look well on that, or society thinks this is important, so we need to pursue this. And he's saying, don't worry about that. Don't fear what they fear. You sanctify me as Lord, and I will make sure everything gets taken care of. There is a chiasm in 1 Peter 3:13 to 4:6. This is the section developing the wilderness trial, the fear of God. And it's mostly done by keywords that connect. We're not going to go through this in great detail, but I do want to point out a couple of things. If you look at the B and the B prime, so 3:14b to 16 says, always be ready to explain your hope to any who ask for a word, a logon. Those slandering your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. In the corresponding section, 4:3 to 5, blasphemers who were surprised that you do not join them in pursuing Gentile lusts will have to give a word to the one who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So note that you're going to have to explain yourself to someone. Mm-hmm. You can either explain yourself to those around you now as to why you're doing what God told you to do, mm-hmm. or you can explain yourself to God later as to why you didn't do what he told you to do. Okay. right? But you're going to have to explain yourself to someone, either the people around you or God, as to why you're not following them. Personally, it'll probably go better for you in the long term if you choose to explain yourself to the people around you now. The other thing I want to point out here is that he talks about Christ going, this is the D frame. Christ went and made proclamation to the spirits who were disobedient in the days of Noah. This is often understood as kind of Christ descending into hell and making a proclamation, and then it becomes, well, why do those people that were in the days of Noah get a special post-death evangelism trip? That's probably not what this is talking about. First of all, if it were talking about human people that he was proclaiming to, you would expect souls, not spirits. Spirits suggest we're dealing with angels or demons or divine kind of characters. And so William Dalton has made a good case, and I think he's right. This is not talking about a descent into hell. It's talking about the ascension. And on his ascension, he goes through the heavenly realms where these angels have been imprisoned. And it's a victory proclamation. I won, you lost. This, by the way, is where that line in the Apostles' Creed that the Methodists have largely cut out about, he descended into hell. This is where that comes from for the most part, but it's probably not talking about that. This is probably referring to the second heaven, which is generally understood to be the realm of angelic darkness, and that's where they're imprisoned. So he goes through that realm on his way to ascending to the Father and the throne. And it's worth noting, too, he talks about baptism now saves you, but he says, I'm not talking about the baptism that is removed of the filth of the flesh. That would be the original water baptism that corresponds to crossing the Sea of Reeds. This baptism is a baptism of fire. It's the baptism of a good conscience towards God. And he said that one is actually going to deliver you now. In other words, so he's writing to a people who are in their wilderness trial. They're trying to do what God has told them. Secular society doesn't like them. Their brothers and sisters in Christ don't like them. Their Christian leadership doesn't approve of what they're doing. They're not a people. They're feel lost and abandoned and alone, wondering how long? When are you going to come and vindicate me? And his message to them is persecution is about to break out. That's going to drive you from your home. It's going to, kick you out. That's actually your salvation. Because it's going to save you from this situation where nobody appreciates what God is doing in you and take you to a place where they will be able to see me in you and people will appreciate you. And so this baptism by fire is ultimately going to work for your salvation. That's when your salvation gets revealed in the last time. It is intended to be fulfilled in every generation. It's basically the empowering of the next generation to take it, to start the process again. And again, the danger is that you give up before it comes and walk away. So you've got to get in your space and then stay in your space and persevere through. So we can distinguish these different steps in Christ's example for believers in Egypt and in the wilderness. The example for believers in Egypt is emphasized in 2:21-25. That's the exhortation of the household slaves, where it actually lays out the steps. For believers in the wilderness, it's highlighted in 3:18-22. And remember, all the phases that are associated with the Spirit and this by sanctification of the Spirit, all have these little vignettes of Jesus, because that's how the Spirit works, by testifying of Jesus. The example for believers in Egypt, the frequency of the suffering, often. People are always going to sin against you. Just until we're all perfected, expect that people are going to do bad things to you. In the wilderness, though, the frequency of the suffering is once. Jesus only goes to the cross once. Okay? You only have to go through this dark night of the soul once. The perpetrators of the suffering, it's usually the flock for believers in Egypt. And this is, who he's modeling it for. So as they sin against him, he forgives them. In the wilderness, it's the spiritual authorities that tend to reject what God is doing in you because it's not what he did in them. Again, remember Matthew 11. God does not reveal to the wise and intelligent what he's doing in the new generation. Christ's response in the example for those in Egypt is to extend forgiveness. For those in the wilderness, it's to intercede on behalf of those who are still outside. It covers sins against Christ, and he's forgiving the sins that are committed against him. In the wilderness, he is sins from those who are above him, enables him to intercede on behalf of sins out there that they've committed against God. The primary benefit and beneficiary in Egypt, it's righteousness for the immature of God's people, because as they are forgiven and they extend forgiveness, then they can grow in righteousness. And restoration or life for those who are estranged from God in the wilderness. And then there are corresponding sacrifices, the peace offering in Egypt and the sin offering in the wilderness.